Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Wednesday, January the 14th, 2026. So long ago, I did a course in horary astrology. That would have been in the sort of very late 80s, and the teacher for this course was a woman called Olivia Barclay, and she was a Sagittarius, and this was a correspondence course. You remember correspondence courses, before the internet, when you had your assignments and you wrote up your assignments and then you sent it to your teacher, amazing as that sounds, and then, maybe a week later or 2 weeks later, whatever, you would get a reply in the mail. And, Olivia, she was a Sagittarius, and I am, of course, a Gemini. I got my sun in Gemini. And I remember I wrote this assignment. I wrote this essay or whatever on some aspect of astrology. And she said at the bottom, she said something like, "You're a Gemini. You're only interested in arguments. I'm interested in the truth." And that is perhaps an illustration of the distinction between a Gemini and a Sagittarius. Now, planets are not quite the same thing as signs. One shouldn't necessarily think that a planet just follows the sign it rules, or vice versa. But when we think about the distinction between Mercury and Jupiter, we might get a similar picture. And that's why I've called this video, or in the thumbnail, I've written sort of Mercury argues, Jupiter moralizes. Well, what we have is Mercury in Capricorn opposition Jupiter in Cancer. I know that Mercury in Capricorn, okay, of all the signs, Capricorn does not have a reputation for being argumentative, but there is still this distinction between Mercury and Jupiter, the fact that they are opposition one another. And this Mercury-Jupiter aspect is a major feature of today, and I do want to look at this aspect in some detail. But first of all, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today. So here is the chart for today, set for noon on Wednesday, January the 14th, 2026, New York time. And, don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. So as far as this chart is concerned, we have the moon in Sagittarius. So, the moon has been in Scorpio for some time. Now it's in a fire sign, and with the moon in a fire sign, well, at least we got something in a fire sign. Okay, we've got Chiron in Aries. I've talked a great deal about Chiron in Aries over the last couple of days. I won't be talking about Chiron in this video, but having moon in Sagittarius, that does create some action, and it may be that finally something is going on. We can perhaps initiate, and we might be able to see how things around us, are connected. Now, the moon in Sagittarius doesn't make many aspects. It makes a sextile to Pluto, at the beginning of the day. I mean, moon in Sagittarius, sextile Pluto in Aquarius. So that is true. But the thing is that we've got a lot of planets in late degrees. So you can see that we've got, Mercury, Mars, Sun, Venus. They're all sort of 20-something Capricorn. We've got Uranus at, 27 Taurus, Saturn at 27 Pisces. They're all in late degrees. The moon is in relatively early degrees. So that means that the moon is not really doing anything at the moment. It's not applying to anything, and that is perhaps relevant. The moon is function, and it's how things come together. I think that from a cognitive point of view, you think about your brain. You've got representations. You've got thoughts. You know what things are, but your brain has got to work. It's got to sort of connect these representations, and perhaps there aren't those connections at the moment, even though Moon in Sagittarius is really looking for connections. It wants connections, but at some level, it's not quite there. But still, we get an idea. We have a feeling that things are changing, and our minds are certainly pretty active at the moment because Mercury is opposition Jupiter. So Mercury opposition Jupiter, well, we've got Mercury at 20 degrees, 19, 20 degrees Capricorn, Jupiter 19, 20 degrees Cancer, 19 Cancer really, they're opposition one another. And that is an important aspect, and that importance is reflected in the fact that it is my headline aspect for today. It's what I'm going to be talking about later in this video. So Mercury opposition Jupiter, well, what is that about? I mean, I'm going to go into detail later in this video, but one way of looking at Mercury opposition Jupiter is to say, well, perhaps Mercury wants to talk. Jupiter maybe wants to do something else. Mercury can sometimes talk too much. I say that as someone with Sun and Mercury and Gemini. It doesn't happen quite so much nowadays, but certainly when I was younger, I would say things, just the first thing that came to my head, and I remember the outrage that you can sometimes cause by saying the wrong thing, and that outrage, it's really off-putting when someone is outraged at just what one says, but it does happen, and so there may be just a distinction between what one says, perhaps on the spur of a moment, and how another person responds. That is a way of looking at it. Mercury is also a planet connected with one's thoughts, and if Mercury is opposition Jupiter, one might be thinking a lot. Okay, one might not be able to do very much with those thoughts, but once the thinking starts, well, there's no end of it, is there? And it just goes on and on, and especially now, when you've got not a great deal directly happening. Mars is still opposition Jupiter, Sun is still opposition Jupiter, even Venus is still kind of opposition Jupiter. But these aspects are diminishing, and especially the fact that we don't have any major lunar aspects, it does indicate that it could be difficult to get things together. So sure, we can have thoughts, but what actually are we going to do with them? And that might be a theme for today. So that is the picture. If I set the chart for New York, if I set the chart for noon in Sydney as a representative of Australia or New Zealand and East Asia, for those of you in that part of the world, you'll see that the moon is earlier in the sign at noon. It's at 0 degrees Sagittarius. So if you are in Australia or New Zealand, it may be the case, is the case that the first part of the day, the moon is going to be in Scorpio, and the moon is going to be quite closely sextile Pluto, and it also will be making an opposition to Uranus. So I would have said, all things being equal, that those of you in Australia or New Zealand or East Asia or Eastern Siberia, perhaps, you're going to have perhaps a more eventful day. Perhaps there's going to be more of a struggle and more that you have to fight against, and that's perhaps because of a moon opposition Uranus. When the moon is in very late Scorpio, and when the moon moves into Sagittarius, it makes a sextile to Pluto. So that moon sextile Pluto could be quite powerful. Not a bad aspect, and maybe it's just easier for you to have an impact. If you want change, you can perhaps create change. And then there is the heliocentric view, setting things up from a perspective of the sun, putting the sun at the center of the center of the solar system. And so here is the heliocentric chart. It's not quite the heliocentric chart because I've got to change the coordinates. Let me just quickly change the coordinates to make sure they are they're heliocentric. There we are. Okay, so that is the heliocentric chart. The Earth is still quite close to the opposition of Mars. It's moving away from the conjunction of Jupiter. And so, okay, perhaps that means that tension levels are starting to decrease. Things aren't quite as hectic as they used to be. But still, I think that we have to be on our guard. Earth opposition Mars, there's still quite a lot of anger in the air, and it's perhaps quite easy for people to get offended. And maybe the fact that we've got geocentrically Mercury opposition Jupiter, that does contribute to it. And additionally, we've got Earth square Chiron. I didn't say I was going to talk about Chiron today. I'm not really going to talk about it, but I can't avoid the fact that that heliocentrically Earth is square Chiron, and that continues with the Chiron theme. There is a T-square involving Chiron heliocentrically, like there was yesterday. I think it's probably closer than it was today. And so, if we're upset, if there's something we're struggling against, things going on in the world that we don't like, then Chiron heliocentrically represents the answer. We have to perhaps speak out about it. We have to perhaps get angry. Now, not all of us can do that. This is a heliocentric T-square, so we're dealing with sort of high, something quite sort of high level. Fortunately, we're seeing a similar picture geocentrically. So Chiron hasn't gone away. So in my last two videos, I talked about Chiron because there were exact Chiron aspects. Now, those Chiron aspects, yes, they're not exact anymore, but still, the message I was conveying about Chiron, it still holds. And, there may be a place for rebellion, and there may be a place for anger. Now, you might say that angry rebellion is not the right way forward, but what is the alternative? The alternative is just suffering in silence, getting annoyed about something and not being able to express it. But maybe we should express it, and maybe Chiron is saying that. And Chiron is saying, well, sometimes we have to make people uncomfortable by, just saying what's on our mind, and it might mean that everything gets disrupted. But we need disruption sometimes. If we think everything is fine and we can just push things under the carpet, I think we're kidding ourselves. So that's the heliocentric view, and now I want to look at today from the perspective of the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Wednesday, January the 14th, 2026. Aries. Things are better. And the reason things are better is, simply that the moon has gone into Sagittarius. The moon doesn't do a great deal in Sagittarius, at least today it doesn't. But it says something about you and the way you feel and the way you respond to everything. And, having the moon in Sagittarius means that it's just easier to be yourself, and you're not so worried about what's going on perhaps emotionally and how other people are going to respond, and you're able to find it easier to sort of look up at what is available, what is happening around you. Now, that doesn't mean to say that you're going to be able to just do whatever you like. Okay, you can do whatever you like, but you might be slightly disappointed with the response because not everyone is on your wavelength. But the point is, you can see clearly and you can see beyond your immediate environment, and that might mean that things are just less claustrophobic. Things have been a little claustrophobic. You wanted to do something about it. Mars was square Chiron yesterday. Mars is still square Chiron, but Now it's just not quite so intense. You can just see what needs to be done. If something bothers you, you can respond, and don't have too many expectations. And it's possible that things take longer than you'd like them to take. So you might say something, and people might respond in a verbal way, but in terms of action, well, that might be a different picture. You have to give people time, and you have to give people space, and to take on board what's going on. And you also have to remember that Moon and Sagittarius, well, it's the only planet in a fire sign unless you count Chiron. So you certainly have a vision, definitely have a vision, but can you actually see it through in terms of concrete action? That may not necessarily be the case, but I know it happens a lot in quite a long time, but in the end, planets will go into Aries. I'm talking about personal planets. It's a long time. It may seem over 2 months before the Sun moves into Aries, but it will happen, and perhaps this gives you an idea, Aries, of what you can do. And probably, Aries, you shouldn't necessarily focus too much on action. Words themselves can have an impact. And I've talked about the fact that Mercury is opposition Jupiter. Now, this Mercury opposition Jupiter, it's a powerful aspect, and you can handle it in the right way, I hope. And think about what it means. I mean, Mercury is in Capricorn. This is about you being able to express what is important, and you can do it with power and conviction. But you have to understand your limits. You have to understand other people's limits. There's only so much people can handle, and so you have to think about what are the impact of your words, and so how are people going to respond. Now, it could be that if you go too far, you get a negative response, but there's another possibility that if you go too far, if you suggest things which just seem unreasonable, you might just be ignored. People just won't hear the words. They will just sort of, blink their eyes and move on, or they might say fine, or they might nod their heads, but there might be no comprehension. So make sure that whatever you are saying is grounded in reality, and additionally takes into account where people are. I mean, you do have to do that. You might be able to think slightly ahead, think about the future, but where are the people you're talking to? Some people are stuck in the past, and you have to accept that. Getting people to move forward, to be in the future, to imagine the future, can be difficult, and you have to give them time. So don't just say the first thing that comes to mind. Think about what you are trying to achieve. It's not enough just to bombard people with words and to tell people all about how you'd like things to be. You've got to be reasonable, and you've got to perhaps slow yourself down. Perhaps, Aries, you're like a piece of technology that is slightly ahead, and you have to adjust yourself to older pieces of technology, like all the people around you, and you've got to sort of almost deliberately downgrade some of your systems, some of your vocabulary, so that you can be understood, so that people will listen to you. And you don't want to be too shocking. I mean, it's good to be shocking to some extent. And Aries, you should not forget that Mars is still square Chiron. I mean, Mars was exactly square Chiron yesterday. It's still there. And there are some things, Aries, that you might find to be genuinely wrong. And Chiron is about compassion. And it's about maybe even righteous anger. Indeed, the Mercury opposition Jupiter could be about righteous anger as well. So if you feel that kind of anger, which some Arians do, they're very good at, actually Aries is a sign which is very good at righteous anger. So if you feel that it's necessary to force the pace to get people to listen and demonstrate that anger, I think that is something you can do. But you have to be aware that if you go too far, there might be a cost. But that's up to you. That's up to you to judge the situation. Taurus, we have a few changes. I think that the big change is the moon leaving Scorpio. The moon is now in Sagittarius. Okay, if you are in Australia or New Zealand, then it might not be till late morning, lunchtime even, that the moon moves out of Scorpio into Sagittarius. But it's going to get there in the end. And with the moon moving into Sagittarius, it might mean that you should be spending a bit less time worrying about other people, what other people are doing, and you need to perhaps think about yourself and your own priorities, and indeed your own intensity. I mean, you can be quite intense. You really can. And once you decide something is important, you'll just want to give it everything you've got. And that just might reflect the whole way in which you are. And the moon, when it moves into Sagittarius, it does make a sextile to Pluto. Now this moon-Pluto sextile might be more of a feature at the beginning of the day, but given that the moon doesn't really make any major aspects at the beginning of Sagittarius, it might well be the case that moon sextile Pluto takes on an added prominence. And this moon sextile Pluto for you, Taurus, I think is quite a constructive energy. It's about you focusing on the things that matter to you. I mean, they might matter to you in quite a sort of a deep emotional way, and you're ready to commit to them. And you're also perhaps able to think about the future and what it is that you would like to achieve. And it may occur to you, Taurus, that in order to get what you want, you have to be perhaps quite intense and quite focused, and you have to be persistent. It's no good just trying something out, giving it a few minutes of your time. You've got to keep going, and the power of your will is really going to matter. So if you can do that, Taurus, I think that you can start to make a real impact, and people are in the end going to listen to you. In the end, I mean, maybe short term it could be hard work, but you are certainly making an impact, and the way you use words is important. I mean, if you use the right words, you can certainly get people's attention. And maybe, Taurus, you can be ever so slightly manipulative in the way you use words, and perhaps you have to sort of tailor what you say to suit the other person. Everyone's got weaknesses. Everyone has got desires. They're greedy for certain things, and they're afraid of certain things as well. And at some level, perhaps, Taurus, all of this. And so that means that you can use your words to get an impact. And it may not just be your words, it just may be the whole way you present yourself. So Taurus, if you take a slow and deliberate approach, you give yourself time, then that gives you the best possible chance of making an impact. And yeah, I think that you really can have an impact, and I do think that people are going to listen to you. But Taurus, if you are going to listen, if you expect other people to listen to you, it works both ways. You've got to do some listening yourself, and don't forget that Mars is still square Chiron, and that Mars square Chiron, that may be more about another person rather than you yourself, and it may be about what annoys other people, not necessarily annoys other people, what other people regard as being super important, and they may not always be honest about it. Perhaps they feel that now is not necessarily a safe time to be completely open and above board, but just be aware that everyone has a view, and give yourself the time and hopefully the opportunity to understand what that view is. But going back to what I say, today is not about you giving in to other people, spending all your time worrying about what other people are doing. Fundamentally, today is about you being more serious, and through that seriousness and that conviction in yourself, making real progress, and certainly making a sort of conceptual progress. You know what you want, you know where you're heading, and you can make some real changes. They may not be immediately obvious, but they are. But it is all happening. So it can be a day when you really can start to tune into your own power. Gemini. Mercury opposition Jupiter. That is the main aspect of the day, and inevitably that is likely to have an impact on you. I mean, Mercury is your ruler after all, and so if Mercury is opposition your Jupiter, then you would expect to be stirred up. There's you. So perhaps Mercury in Capricorn. You might be happy in your world to some extent, but Jupiter is challenging you. And so what is that about? Well, it can work on many different levels. Jupiter may say nothing about the external world, but instead may say something about you and what you are thinking about. Jupiter can stir things up. It can represent thoughts that come from nowhere, but quite high level thoughts, and you thought you were going in one direction, but then your thoughts go in another direction, and so this could be this idea of thoughts going all over the place. Now, Mercury is in Capricorn and Jupiter's in Cancer, so these are cardinal signs. They're also negative signs by definition, because it's earth and water. So it's not as crazy as it would be if it was air plays fire, or for example, I don't know, Mercury in Gemini opposition Jupiter in Sagittarius. It's not quite like that, but your thoughts are being challenged, and there are challenging ideas, and if you feel a challenge, your mind can just keep going, and that is a Gemini feature. The Gemini mind is very difficult to quiet, and it's particularly difficult to quiet at the moment. And so don't get overwhelmed by your own thoughts, and it could be that if your thoughts are getting out of hand, that you need to do something different. You need to do something quite physical, maybe. Whatever is appropriate. I mean, gardening, going for a walk, doing something that requires intense concentration, where you can't spend all your time thinking. If you can just quieten your brain just for a moment, I think that would be useful. But yeah, there is a challenge. And what kind of challenge is that? I mean, part of the challenge might be that things are simpler than you thought they were. And you might think, well, why is that a challenge? Well, Geminis can like to make things complicated. You have all these reasons, and it's like this, and it's like that, and it's. But the truth of the matter might be very straightforward. What is the truth of the matter? Well, you could say the truth of the matter is represented by Jupiter. It's there. It's right in front of you. For some reason, Gemini, you don't want to accept the truth of the matter. And the truth of the matter perhaps is boring, because at some level you enjoyed the complications, or the truth of the matter could be embarrassing. It could be just an awareness that you made a simple mistake, and that's the way it is. Now, this Mercury opposition Jupiter, it is possible that it has a financial dimension. I mean, this Mercury-Jupiter opposition, is across the finance axis of your chart. Cancer, Jupiter in Cancer plays Mercury in Capricorn, and I would have said that Jupiter does represent perhaps just accepting things as they are financially, and if you accept things as they are financially, and you realize the opportunities, for sure. You perhaps also are aware of your mistakes. Sometimes when you're thinking about a financial mistake, indeed any mistake, if you're a Gemini, you might come up with all sorts of reasons why it happened, but it just could fundamentally be that you messed up, or you should have known better. It just could have been just as simple as that. And maybe that's what Jupiter is telling you. It's simple. It's not complicated. And you perhaps could have done something better. And what are you going to do next time? And is the thing going to repeat? So the Mercury-Jupiter opposition, I think, could be quite challenging. And it might mean that you have to admit that in the past, perhaps even the recent past, that you've made a mistake. And no one wants to admit they made a mistake, particularly if they're a Gemini. Now, if we're talking about Mercury opposition Jupiter, inevitably we have to talk about relationships, because Mercury rules Gemini, Sagittarius rules Sagittarius, which is of course your opposite sign. So if you've got Mercury opposition Jupiter, this might represent two people who have different opinions. And William Lilly, in his book Christian Astrology, which he wrote in the 17th century, the middle of the 17th century, he talked about squares and oppositions, and he said that a square is perfect enmity and an opposition is perfect hatred. Now, that is an exaggeration, but that gives you an idea about the opposition. An opposition, perfect hatred. Okay, I'm not really talking about hate, but it just may occur to you that you and another person have completely different views on a number of subjects. And, in the headline of this video, I talked about, Mercury argues, Jupiter moralizes. Jupiter is a moral planet, and there could be a moral clash. You and someone else have very different views about an important matter of the day. And when I say an important matter, perhaps an important matter relating to what's going on in the world. Some of the big controversies in the world. And there are lots of controversies. Now, that might mean, Gemini, that perhaps in certain situations you should avoid talking about politics or controversial issues, because it might occur to you that maybe someone you've been dealing with for a long time, you do have different views. And this Mercury-Jupiter opposition can have implications for relationships. It's not saying that relationships are going to disintegrate, but it's about hatred and whatever. But if you are spending a lot of time with another person, do be aware of the differences. And you can have differences about a number of things. And while those differences are not aired, it's not important. But there can always be that moment, can't there, with another person, when you're with another person and everything's fine, and then you just say something. And you just say something and you can't unsay it. And it's said. And you just can get yourself into a whole load of trouble. At least you can get yourself into a whole load of trouble, if you're a Gemini. And so do be aware of that. And perhaps, Gemini, if you're in a relationship which is important, or in a relationship where you and the other person don't completely know each other, even if you have kind of known each other for years, there still might be areas which haven't yet been explored, and just a word out of place could cause a lot of trouble. So, do be careful what you say. And just because you think something doesn't necessarily mean that you should actually go and say it. Cancer. Perhaps Cancer, things are, calming down. I've talked about these, these big oppositions between on one hand Jupiter, and on the other hand, all those Capricorn planets. Yeah, there are still a load of planets in Capricorn, a load of planets in your opposite sign, and that does stay true. It's still there. Yesterday I talked about Mars being square Chiron, but a lot of these aspects are starting to separate, and so you might feel that things very slowly are getting back to normal, and that it's just easier to think, easier to be yourself, and perhaps there's less going on. And if you're a Cancerian, I would have said you'd be quite happy if less is going on, because it can just all become rather too much. And so instead of worrying about all the many things that might be happening, perhaps it's time to think about yourself and think about how you want to just put everything in order. And maybe there is a lot to get into order. Maybe there are things that have been building up since Christmas and the New Year, and finally you have an idea about how you would like things to be. And the moon is moving into Sagittarius. It doesn't really do much at the beginning of Sagittarius. I mean, it makes a sextile to Pluto, but sextile to Pluto is a relatively minor aspect, a helpful aspect. It allows you to perhaps transform, but also with Pluto, we should perhaps see Pluto as being about elimination. Elimination is a word that you can use with Pluto, just getting rid of things which are no longer useful. And maybe that's what the moon sextile Pluto can do for you. Just if things had been building up, you haven't known what to do with them, and you can perhaps realize that they don't really have any part in your life, so you can just clear a space. And once you've cleared the space, I just don't think there's going to be much in your way, and things should resolve pretty easily. Though don't forget, we've still got a lot of action there with Jupiter opposition with Capricorn planets and Chiron involved. I'm not saying that everything is suddenly going to get super easy, and maybe there'll be times when you feel the film is repeating itself. When I say, what is the film repeating itself? A situation is repeating itself, and you might be saying, oh, here we go again. But this time round, some of the intensity and the power has gone. And I think that, overall Cancer, it's just a situation where you're going to feel more in control. And if you want something to happen, I don't think there's going to be a great deal of resistance. Maybe a bit boring, but maybe at some level, Cancer, you will appreciate a a certain amount of boringness, because when things are boring, it does mean that you have choices. Leo, it's feeling good at the moment. I mean, it's feeling better. I mean, the moon is moving out of Scorpio, and moon in Scorpio. It's always good at some level for the moon to be in Scorpio, because when the moon is Scorpio, perhaps, Leo, you have a chance to regenerate. You can perhaps fall back onto your own resources. You don't necessarily have to socialize. You don't have to signal anything. You can just work things out on your own. But it can become a bit too much of a good thing. And certainly if you're in Australia or New Zealand, you've got moon opposition Uranus, particularly at the beginning of the day, and so that moon opposition Uranus perhaps would be the last hurrah of the moon being in Scorpio. Something happening, something you have to think about, something disturbing you, and you think that things are going to get more difficult. And then the moon moves into Sagittarius, and so moon moving into Sagittarius, moon is moving into a fire sign, and you feel that you're again at the center of things. You're in a position where you are able to be in control, and also to do things that you enjoy, and that's important. Now, you might not get a great deal of support. You might not be noticed, but does that really matter? Just remember, Leo, that if you are enjoying it, and if you are taking pleasure in something, then you don't need any help or support. I mean, if it's something genuine that is an important part of yourself, then you can just do it in your own way, and I don't think that there'll be much in the way of interference. Although you're certainly aware of what could get in your way. I mean, I think that many Leos have a fair concept of the meaning of power and constraint, and you may be very aware of the power of the government or other administrative and bureaucratic structures. If you think about it, it kind of depends who you are. I mean, some people are just not bothered by what's going on around them. They're not bothered by political and bureaucratic processes. But in the end, it affects all of us. And I think that you, Leo, kind of have an advance warning. It happens as soon as you read the newspaper. Okay, I know people don't read the newspaper anymore, but as soon as you look at the internet, look at your favorite news channel, you see what's going on, and it immediately gets to you the fact that there are powerful forces out there, and the individual can often be under threat. And as a Leo, that does get to you. I mean, as a Leo, your individuality and your ability to act as an individual, really does matter. And at the moment, you can see the things that could be holding you back, that could prevent you doing the things that you want to do, and that might feel quite confrontational, though it does have there is another alternative way of looking at things, and it kind of depends on you. But if you are in any position of power, however minor that power is, particularly if you're supported by some other organization or some other bureaucracy, if you're a civil servant or a bureaucrat or a police officer, for example, then you're actually going to have a strong sense of your own power. And that means for a few Leos, I mean, not all Leos, just a small minority of Leos, there's just some slight danger of misusing your power. It is possible. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if you have any power over anyone, even if it's relatively trivial, even if it's in the family, perhaps, if you've got any power over another person or another group of people, do think about how you use that power, and don't assume that things are simple and straightforward. I mean, I think at some level, Leo, you would like things to be straightforward, and if you have ideas, for example, about the way things should be organized, and perhaps how the way other people should organize themselves, it's not as simple as it looks, and you have to be aware of the silent factor, something unexplained, something you hadn't considered that you need to consider. So if you have any clear plans, particularly if other people are involved, don't just go storming ahead. Don't assume necessarily that everyone's going to fit in, because it might not happen like that. And so just be aware of that unexpected factor, that factor that it just crops up. It could be the human factor, or it could be the emotional factor. If you're not working with other people, if you're doing something on your own, you might have thought about everything, you're doing it, and then suddenly you start to see things in an emotional way, and perhaps your emotions, your unconscious, are telling you something, and you have to take it into account. And so don't just stay with it. Don't allow yourself to be just disturbed, but just carry on regardless. No, it's not like that. The first sign of a disturbance, then stop what you're doing and think, have you made too many assumptions? And by reorganizing things and having a slightly more sensitive approach, and by accepting the human factor, I think you might be doing yourself and everyone else a favor. Virgo. Mercury is, of course, your ruler, and Mercury is opposition Jupiter, and so that's got to be important. And one has to think, what does it mean for your planet, your ruler, to be in this opposition relationship? And it could be about some kind of challenge. You, Virgo, at the moment, Mercury is in Capricorn, and that's a good place for Mercury to be in Capricorn. Especially if you're a Virgo, it means that you're able to do things that I think that you enjoy doing. You have a sense of not just your own power, but your ability to create things and to be able to do things that you enjoy. And you can, I think, present yourself very well, and you have a real sense of your own power, and also your own agency. And it's not just the fact we've got Mercury in Capricorn. We've got a load of planets in Capricorn. We've got four planets in Capricorn. So that's well and good. And I think you're going to be additionally into yourself and into sort of what you're doing, because Moon is in Sagittarius, and with Moon in Sagittarius for you, Virgo, that is about you, and it's about your space, your world, and so you're doing things you enjoy, and you're sorting things out in your own way, and it's all good. But then there's Jupiter. Jupiter might be experienced as an irritation, and in terms of how I headed this video, I called it sort of Mercury argues, Jupiter moralizes. So that is about Mercury not necessarily arguing. Perhaps I've oversimplified the matter, but you being relatively comfortable with what you're doing, but then something comes along and says, is that right? Now, Jupiter in Cancer can represent other people. It can represent society. It can represent you being made to feel that you're being selfish. Maybe we can use maybe in some cases maybe you're being gaslit. It's possible. You're being told that you're thinking something that you're not necessarily doing, or you're being told you're behaving in a particular way when you're not. And so you have to really carefully evaluate your relationship to society and your relationship to other people, especially if you are being criticized. Okay, you may not be being criticized directly, but you just may feel the hostility or the condemnation of others. And so how are you going to respond? I mean, one way of responding is to give in, to say, well, you don't want to stand out. You may be doing something that you really enjoy, but you can't be selfish, can you? That is an approach. That is a response. I don't think that is the right approach. And perhaps you have to be aware that at some level you are at odds with society, that you are at odds with other people. You can't always follow the line. Sometimes you do have to do things differently. But it may be in some small way you're not taking other people into consideration. I mean, Jupiter can be a moral force. And it might be the case with Mercury in Capricorn opposition Jupiter in Cancer that you are just taking things at face value, and you're thinking, well, this is the way it is, so that's what you're going to do, and there's just something you've forgotten. And Jupiter in Cancer is just reminding you that people have feelings, that people have powerful feelings, and those feelings can't always be ignored. But I don't think this is a time to be entirely giving in to external pressure, but I think you need to accept that external pressure exists, and you perhaps need to make decisions. So you become aware of what other people want, and you make a conscious decision perhaps to give them something or to give them nothing. But the point is that you're making a decision. If you're oblivious and you just sort of ignore other people, you don't take into account what they're thinking, then it's possible you might be in for an unpleasant surprise when you realize what people really think, what they really believe. And that can be a shock. So Virgo, especially when it comes to dealing with other people, just don't take things at face value. I mean, when I say face value, so that's probably not the best way of talking about it. Don't just look at things on the surface. You think, oh, it's okay because everything seems to be okay on the surface. Maybe things aren't okay, and so try to understand, what other people are doing and what other people are thinking. And this Mercury opposition Jupiter could well have something to do with relationships. It could impact relationships, and if we're completely literal about it, Mercury opposition Jupiter could be about a disagreement that you and another person, perhaps a person who is important to you, do not agree about a matter of some importance, and you have to perhaps work with that agreement, with that disagreement. It's not that you have to give up or give anything away, but you have to be aware of it and work out, what is the best way around it. And perhaps you have to accept disagreement. You can't be friends with everyone. You can't be in agreement with everyone. Even if that person is very important to you, even if you spend your life with them, there are still maybe areas where you just can't see eye to eye. Libra. It's probably of some relief that the moon is moving out of Scorpio and into Sagittarius. I think with the moon moving into Sagittarius, Libra, you feel more freedom. Probably there are more possibilities for action. And when I'm talking about action, I'm really talking about sort of mental action. I mean, you can see the possibilities for real action, physical action, but are you actually able to go through with those possibilities? Well, maybe not. And today, there could be a lot of talking and a lot of thinking, but in terms of actually getting things off the ground, well, that might not be the case. You perhaps have to be patient, because it's not necessarily a time for grand initiatives, but you can see that sooner or later something does have to be done, and you can't procrastinate forever. As a Libra, sometimes you do procrastinate. You think about, what is the right thing to do. Libra is obviously the sign of the balance. You're trying to weigh things up, and how things work, and are things working well, and you want to, as far as possible, carry other people with you. You don't necessarily want to be, out on a limb, but perhaps it's necessary. But at the moment, it's perhaps a time for exploration, perhaps through what you're reading, what you're researching, and for what you're talking about. And so don't hold back. If you find something interesting, then perhaps you can get into it, and you can indeed explore. And so, Libra, you have the ability at the moment to ask, quite deep, sort of penetrating questions. You can question yourself, and you can also question other people. So if you are looking for answers, then I think you're going to actually be quite good at finding those answers. And because you're a Libra, you're capable of being quite sort of subtle and roundabout. So if you're looking for information and you think that someone is holding on to it, then you can ask sort of these questions which are sort of a bit sort of roundabout. They're not very direct, but you know what you're doing. And in your own way, Libra, you can actually be quite manipulative today. So, you can use words in a way that's very effective, and it could well be the case, Libra. But at the moment, words are more important than acts. I mean, you could say that a word is an act, but if you're actually doing something physical in the real world, you might have limited impact. But if you are actually saying something or writing something and someone hears you, then you are having an impact. You are having an influence. And perhaps, that's what you should be working on, remembering that the moon, when it moves into Sagittarius, makes a sextile to Pluto. And so through the way you carry yourself, through the way you communicate, you can change things. Yeah, it is quite subtle, but it's also very real. Now, one aspect that we do have, which is obviously the main theme of this video, is an opposition between Mercury and Jupiter. And we've had an opposition between Jupiter and the Capricorn planets for a long time. And so what's been happening is that these Capricorn planets have been clicking away and moving into late Capricorn. They've all been making their oppositions to Jupiter in turn. And now Mercury is making an opposition to Jupiter. And for you, Libra, that perhaps is a challenge, and it kind of reminds you of how these Capricorn planets have been impacting you. I think that these Capricorn planets have at some level been weighing you down. Not necessarily in a bad way, but you have been thinking about your priorities, and you perhaps have also been quite protective. But now that these Capricorn planets, when they opposition Jupiter, each time they make an opposition to Jupiter, it's a challenge. It's a challenge from perhaps the outside world. It's a challenge to move things forward. It's a challenge from Jupiter. And, Jupiter has been in Cancer, a very high-profile sector of your chart, since last summer. It's going to stay there until this summer. I think it stays there until July. And so while Jupiter is in Cancer, this is a time, as I've been telling you repeatedly, it is a time to think about your ambitions and what you need to do. And with Mercury opposition Jupiter, you're reminded that time stops for no one, and you might be happy where you are, but it just can't go on like this forever. And so you can see what could be done in theory, but the question is, are you actually going to do it? Okay, I'm not saying you have to do anything right now, but you just have to be aware that the clock is ticking. Sooner or later, Jupiter will be out of Cancer and into Leo, and you don't want that to be a missed opportunity. But if you're having an insight about what could be done, Libra, then I think that would be good news, because it shows what can happen, I think, very soon, when the situation changes. And maybe that change will happen as planets start moving into Aquarius. And of course that matters, because Aquarius is a sign that has a natural affinity with Libra, your sign. And so things can really start to move in an easy way once planets go into Aquarius. But right now, Libra, no need to panic. You're fine. You're understanding what needs to be done. So there's no need for action. But a bit of talking, a bit of discussing, a bit of thinking, that could all be very, very useful. Scorpio, the moon is moving out of your sign and into Sagittarius, and so that in itself might create a bit of a change. Perhaps the focus is less on you and what you are doing, what you are presenting to the world, and you can perhaps focus on other things, perhaps asking yourself, what do you need to do? Okay, you know who you are, you know what you want to do, but what are the requirements? So that might be how you experience the moon moving into Sagittarius. And of course, when the moon moves into Sagittarius, it makes a sextile to Pluto. And this moon sextile Pluto may actually be very grounding. Moon sextile Pluto allows you to really, concentrate on yourself and on what you need. Perhaps that's something that you had forgotten, ironically, while the moon was in Scorpio. Now you're thinking about what you would require in order to feel comfortable and secure, and also what you need in order to achieve your ambitions, whatever those ambitions might be. Additionally, we have an opposition between Mercury and Jupiter. Now, this Mercury-Jupiter aspect, it's the main event of the day, and it is likely to affect you in some respects. I don't think that this aspect is of crucial importance to the average Scorpio, but it just may be, Scorpio, that you have been thinking about things in a particular way, and you have maybe been gathering information. That's something that Scorpios like to do. Scorpios can be very good researchers. You're trying to understand your world, and if you've got ambitions, well, you've got to do your research, and you collect things together, and that's slowly starting to make sense. And then Mercury opposition Jupiter may present a challenge. You become aware of something that is confusing, and it may be contradicting some of your earlier thoughts. And so the question is, what do you do? There is a temptation here to just close your eyes. If you see something that that doesn't fit your overall worldview, then it might be easiest just to ignore it. Just tell yourself it doesn't exist. But I don't think that would be sensible. And these oppositions. Remember, all those 4 Capricorn planets, those 4 planets in Capricorn, have all made aspects to Jupiter, and now we've got this Mercury making an opposition to Jupiter. It's reminding you that Jupiter's in Cancer. Jupiter's been in Cancer, since last summer, and it's there for a reason. This Jupiter in Cancer is a potentially quite an enlightening force. It really is encouraging you to see things in a different way, and there could well be a spirituality to it. I mean, Jupiter in Cancer can represent the supernatural. It can represent an aspect of the divine, something beyond yourself, something that is immortal, and it could, of course, be a higher part of yourself. And so this energy, whatever it is, wants to be heard, and perhaps some of your ideas, some of the things you're working on, may be ever so slightly out of sync. And it's all about knowledge. Knowledge cannot be perfect. You can try your hardest to gather the facts, to understand what it's all about, but if it doesn't make perfect sense, it doesn't make perfect sense. That's the way it is. I mean, and we may be talking about some event which takes place, or indeed which has taken place, which does give you pause for thought. I mean, yesterday I talked a lot about Mars being square Chiron, and I talked about Mars square Chiron for the average Scorpio could be about anger, just something making you annoyed. And Scorpios can get angry, particularly if they see bad things going on, if they see injustice. Scorpios want to respond, and when something happens in the outside world that forces you to respond, well, it's a new point of information, and it might be that you're just becoming aware that things are more complicated than you had realized. So if you're thinking that you've got all the answers, that you've really got the final piece in the jigsaw, I think you'd be wrong, and you should be happy that you're wrong, because if you really have come up with all the answers, if you absolutely know the truth of the matter and that's it, then there's no progress, is there? And that kind of contradicts the whole concept of human development. It is about human development, and it's about Scorpio developing, and the Scorpio is always about a process of development. You move into one stage, and you synthesize what you know, and then one thing breaks up and moves into something else, and it's constantly moving, and it's always moving in the same direction. It should be moving in the same direction. So I do think that this Mercury opposition Jupiter, could be really useful, but certainly challenging, because you might find out things or become aware of things that at some level you don't really want to know about. And there are ways of moving things on, and if something doesn't make sense, maybe something needs to be said, and by saying something out loud you might get a response, and the response might well be surprising. You thought you knew someone, you thought you understood a situation, and as soon as you speak, or perhaps you write, you send an email, you send a letter, as soon as you get that response, you know the truth of the matter. And so it could be a great time for testing. If you're trying to work something out, if you're trying to work another person out, then you say something that might be deliberately controversial, and then by seeing how they respond to what you've said, you're in a position to make a judgment, and you can decide, for example, whether or not you want to trust someone, whether you want to have someone in your life, whether you want to be part of something. So it might actually be a great day for testing the waters. Sagittarius. Moon is moving into your sign, and that's certainly something to be excited about. I mean, the moon has been moving through Scorpio for the last couple of days, and with the moon moving through Scorpio, things might have been a bit unsatisfactory with moon and Scorpio. Rather slow. I mean, you certainly were aware that big things were going on. Maybe huge things were going on, but you didn't necessarily feel yourself to be quite part of it. And, with the moon moving into Sagittarius, things are perhaps becoming clearer. You're starting to, understand, what's going on, and you can more in the center of things. And additionally, the moon, when it moves into Sagittarius, it makes a sextile to Pluto. And so that sextile to Pluto gives you the power and certainly the ability to say what's on your mind. And if you're open, upfront and honest, I think that is very much going to be appreciated, and you're going to feel good about it as well, because there are some things that you might have been keeping to yourself, and it's just become a bit too much. And honesty can open many doors. Yet while this is happening, we do have an opposition between Mercury and Jupiter. This is an important aspect, and this is an aspect involving your planet, your ruling planet. So Mercury opposition Jupiter. Well, there are a number of ways of thinking about this aspect. It could be that we just need to think about Mercury, and Mercury is a planet of thinking and analyzing, and it just might be a time where you are thinking more than usual. A lot of things to think about, a lot of things to work out, and it could also be about talking. Mercury is a planet of communication. I think overall it is a time when you're going to be relatively communicative, at least more communicative than usual. So there are a lot of things to say, and you're also aware of other people's words. Maybe a lot of other people have things to say. So how are you going to respond to it? Well, this Mercury opposition Jupiter, it is a difficult aspect. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, it's not a trine, and it might be that what you say causes confusion. People are not necessarily comfortable with what you're saying, but it could work the other way. It could be that you don't like what you're hearing. It doesn't fit in. And as far as you're concerned, some people might be concerned with things which are just maybe even beneath you. I mean, we might be thinking about Jupiter in Cancer. So Jupiter in Cancer, okay, you could say that's you. Jupiter as a planet can be quite moral. Going back to what I was saying in my thumbnail, I said, Mercury argues, Jupiter moralizes. Many Sagittarians do have a moral view. They have a very clear sense of what is right and wrong. And I think that is sometimes underestimated. And, they have principles. And so with Jupiter in Cancer, it actually could be that those principles are stronger than usual. Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, and that may say something about you. So you listen to what other people are saying, and maybe you don't appreciate it. Maybe we're talking about people you know well, maybe your family or friends. It could be what people are saying on YouTube. It could be what I'm saying. Whatever you hear, those words are challenging, and you might find those words to be offensive. Now, Jupiter is stronger than Mercury right now. I know Jupiter's going retrograde, but Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, and so you have a certain dignity, and so it's quite possible, Sagittarius, that you have the moral high ground. I mean, it's difficult for me to say that in a way, because no one should assume they have the moral high ground, and I'm always a bit nervous when people seize the moral high ground. But I think maybe you do have the moral high ground. There may be certain matters where you just know you're right. You are in the right. Okay, there's no such thing as an objective truth. I know that. But you might be, in this case, or in whatever that case is, that whatever case situation you're dealing with today, yeah, you might be right. And other people might be wrong. And the more they say, the more they argue, the more obvious it is to you that they are in the wrong. And the question then is, what is the best way of dealing with it? And you have to be tactful up to a point, but sometimes there is no choice. Sometimes you have to really express your feelings, and that can be what seizing a moral high ground is about. It's about laying down the law. I mean, laying down the moral law. And perhaps if you do that, and you do that with a certain amount of subtlety, you can actually get away with it. And I think perhaps you can. So if you want to set yourself up as someone who is in the right, who is moral, who knows the rules, who knows the law, that I think is something you very much can do. Now, this Mercury opposition Jupiter, if you want to keep it simple, Mercury opposition Jupiter can be about relationships, close relationships perhaps, certainly one-to-one relationships, and it's an opposition. And when Mercury and Jupiter are in opposition, it just does mean that you and another person don't necessarily get on. There may be differences of opinion. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the relationship is compromised, but I think in any relationship you have to accept that there are differences, there are fault lines, and maybe that Mercury-Jupiter opposition is going to give you an awareness of them, and that's then where your maturity kicks in. You have to ask yourself, how do you deal with a conflict, and how do you make things stable? Because you have to accept differences, and you have to hold on to what you believe in, but at the same time, you don't want to get involved in sort of outright warfare. That's not what it's about. And sometimes it just may be a question of agreeing to differ. Capricorn. You probably, Capricorn, want to watch things from a distance. Now that the moon is moving into Sagittarius. I mean, you've done your best. You've certainly, I hope, been an active player, and you have been, very much able to present, who you are and what you stand for. It's something you can still do. I mean, Mercury is making an opposition to Jupiter. That is, quite a major aspect, which I'll be talking about in a moment. But with the moon moving into Sagittarius, moving out of Scorpio, there's a lot of stuff that appears to be going on. But do you really need to get involved? And if you were to get involved, would it make a difference? Because I think that with the moon in Sagittarius, it could be a lot of fuss about nothing. People getting worked up about one thing and another thing, thinking that everything is very exciting, and however hard they try, it's all going nowhere. At least short term, it's going nowhere. Certainly today, it's going nowhere. So Capricorn, why get involved? And instead, just be comfortable and confident, wherever you are, because the Capricorn light has not been turned off. You're not someone who can be ignored. Certainly, while you've got 4 planets in Capricorn, you're always there. You are always projecting yourself. So there's no need for you to do anything, for you to to take any initiatives. But Mercury is opposition Jupiter, and Mercury is of course in Capricorn. It's in your sign, and so Mercury opposition Jupiter might indicate the potential for conflict. I mean, it's a conflict aspect. It's in opposition. Mercury in Capricorn, perhaps represents your ideas. What you believe to be the case, how you want to proceed. And Mercury in Capricorn can be, quite practical. You're going to go through this, one step at a time. Then Mercury opposition Jupiter, you might have to deal with other people, and their way of handling things. And I think Capricorn, you might be somewhat disappointed by other people's emotionality. I mean, I know Saturn is your ruler, Saturn is in Pisces, you're quite capable of being emotional yourself, but it just could feel that some people are just being too emotional. There are things that they're too worked up about, too precious about certain things, and that's maybe something that you should tolerate. It's often said that if you see a disagreement, then it's best to be open about it. But, is that really always the case? Sometimes it's best to just accept things as they are, let them be, and just refuse to get involved. And, also be aware that, sometimes the things you say, and you're not known, Capricorn, as someone who just talks for the sake of it. But in spite of your attempts to keep yourself to yourself, you might find yourself being tempted to say things, and maybe you'll say too much. You'll say something that causes a problem, and someone responds to it, and then you have to respond to it, and it just becomes all rather unfortunate. So maybe with this Mercury opposition Jupiter, you shouldn't say anything, at least short term, and unless it's a real matter of life and death. Maybe maybe you're dealing with some people who just think they're right. They know they're right. They won't be told. And if that is the case, why intervene? Let the situation develop in its own way, and then calm down in its own way. And what I said about Moon in Sagittarius, particularly early Sagittarius, it just could be a lot of fuss about nothing. Although, when it comes to relationships and people's behavior in general, Capricorn, I think you should expect certain people to behave in a way that is not necessarily something you anticipated. People can do things out of the blue. They can say things out of the blue. They can appear out of the blue. They can also disappear as well. So, don't put yourself in a situation where you are absolutely relying on someone doing something in a particular way. There could be a surprise, and when you see someone behaving in a surprising way, don't necessarily respond or panic. It's just the way it is. Although consider the possibility that the reason people are behaving in the way they are is because they're responding to you. There may be something about you that is kind of difficult to work out. You're not necessarily wanting to be up front, but you are still presenting personality and power, and this might make some people nervous, and that might in turn impact their behavior. But don't worry. I mean, it's all a reflection of you and the fact that you are fundamentally in control. Aquarius. Moon is changing sign. The moon is moving out of Scorpio and into Sagittarius. And the moon, when it moves into Sagittarius, it makes a sextile to Pluto. And I think that this sextile to Pluto is something pretty good. I mean, after all, Pluto is moving through your sign, and with moon sextile Pluto, I think that this does indicate that you can have an impact, and additionally you can be quite effective in a social sense. So, and for example, in terms of your social life, if you're spending your time, with other people, trying to get in touch with other people, I think that you really can have a real influence. And if you want to create change, perhaps because you're not happy with the way things are, or you just like things to be better, then I think you can, because I do believe that right now people are going to listen to you, and they're going to accept your view, perhaps because there's something about you that is exciting and future orientated, but do try to be patient. Don't think that things are just going to be sorted out, but there's going to be an immediate resolution. I mean, I think that today has a lot of potential, but the question is all of that potential necessarily going to be revealed? I think probably not. And so that's one way of looking at it. And additionally, you are someone who can get attention, without necessarily even trying. And you have the ability, if you so wish, to stir things up. You can stir things up in terms of some of the relationships you're in. If for example, relationships you're in seem a bit sort of sameish, you just keep going on in the same old way, and you think that things should be improved or enhanced or maybe disrupted, I don't think that should be much of a problem. So you certainly can have a real impact here, I think. So it's not, Aquarius, I don't think a super dramatic day. It's not a day where I don't think it's a day when you are necessarily compelled to do anything, but if you want to make things happen to some extent, then yeah, you can make them happen. I know that there's an opposition between Mercury and Jupiter today, and I've been sort of trying to describe this Mercury-Jupiter aspect in terms of each of the 12 signs. For you, I get the feeling that this Mercury-Jupiter opposition isn't necessarily too important, at least compared with how other signs are experiencing. But it's possible that you have some thoughts and you have some ideas, and some of these ideas are potentially quite practical, absolutely workable, but you've been kind of keeping them to yourself, and you haven't been open about them, and you may even have had your doubts. It's all very well to think about things, and we all have thoughts. We have trains of thought. We thought, oh, it would be nice if I could do that or that. So, but you haven't really necessarily done anything about it. And maybe the Mercury-Jupiter opposition is saying to you, well, what are you going to do? You can't just expect things to sort themselves out all by themselves. You can have brilliant ideas, but unless those ideas are enacted, then they're just going to die. They're going to wither on the vine, and that is absolutely not what you want to happen. And so maybe with this Mercury opposition Jupiter, something is telling you to get it together. It's telling you that you've got to put in the work. And Jupiter wants you to put in the work. And Jupiter is maybe looking at his watch, saying, you have not got all the time in the world. You've got a lot of time. You might have 6 months, but 6 months can just disappear like that. And with this Mercury opposition Jupiter, this is perhaps a reminder of the importance of time. I know that one doesn't usually associate Jupiter with time. One thinks about Saturn as being the ruler of time. Well, Jupiter's ruler of time as well. Jupiter and Saturn are the chronocrators, and I think that Jupiter wants you to do something, and it's just a gentle reminder at this stage. I mean, certainly no need to panic. Pisces. The main aspect today is Mercury opposition Jupiter, and this Mercury-Jupiter opposition is clearly, relevant to you because Jupiter's your ruler, and with Mercury opposition Jupiter, something is getting at you, I think. It is an opposition. I would not necessarily regard this Mercury opposition Jupiter as being easy, and it might be an irritant. And so the irritation could well come from other people. I mean, Jupiter in Cancer, in a water sign, you're a water sign. It's well placed, except for the fact that it's retrograde. But I wouldn't have said we should worry too much about the fact that it's retrograde. But okay, Jupiter retrograde. One thing about Jupiter being retrograde, and I know that Jupiter goes retrograde for a long time, is that it can represent a certain amount of uncertainty. You know that you're doing the right thing, but you sometimes have your doubts. And you can have doubts about perhaps your potential. Are you really as good as you think you are? Maybe you need to rethink things. And also, because Jupiter is retrograde, you can, sometimes have some self-doubt, and it's easy for that self-doubt to be stirred. Yeah, it can be stirred by what people say. And sorry about this, I just had to look at exactly when Jupiter goes retrograde. I think off the top of my head it is retrograde. I just want to tell you when it stops going retrograde, given I'm talking about it. So Jupiter goes direct on around the 13th of April. So yeah, we've got a few months while Jupiter is retrograde, and during that period between now and the middle of April, you might have doubts, even though in your heart of hearts you've got it right. It's easy to be influenced by what you hear, and maybe that's what this Mercury opposition Jupiter is about. Perhaps you come across people who aren't sympathetic, they aren't enthusiastic. Or it may not be people, it may be just information. You read too much, you think too much, and you convince yourself that you've got it all wrong. So I'm thinking with this Mercury opposition Jupiter that in most cases you need to hold firm. You shouldn't allow outside irritations to hold you back. But maybe there is another way of looking at it. Fundamentally, you are right. You're going in the right direction. Of course you're going in the right direction. North Node is in Pisces. But Mercury opposition Jupiter might be saying, well, maybe there are some small things that you haven't got right. Not the main thing, but some small things, some small details that just could be adjusted. Adjustment here, adjustment there. Things will be much easier, much better. You'll be in a much stronger position. So that might be a constructive way to use Mercury opposition Jupiter. Now, Mercury opposition Jupiter additionally can, of course, say something about relationships. I mean, Jupiter represents you. Jupiter's ruler of Pisces. Mercury is ruler of Virgo, your opposite sign. So you have Mercury opposition Jupiter, and it's just an aspect that can undermine certain relationships. Yeah, maybe not the most important relationships in your life, but it's perhaps what people say, what people do, and it's just annoying. And yeah, maybe some people are annoying. It could even be that the most important people in your life are annoying, temporarily at least, through what they say and the ideas they come up with. And so perhaps, Pisces, you need to be tolerant. You need to let people be stupid and trivial and mindless up to a point. And there always comes a point where you feel that you have to take a stand. Remember, Jupiter is your ruler. Jupiter rules Pisces, just a reminder. It's not Neptune. Neptune has an association with Pisces. I'm quite willing to concede that. But fundamentally, traditionally, Jupiter is ruler of Pisces. And, if you feel that someone has crossed the line, perhaps in a moral way, because, there is a morality to Jupiter, then perhaps you have to do something. Perhaps you have to say something. Perhaps you have to really, make it clear that something is unacceptable. But hopefully it won't get to that level. And that's it. Those are my forecasts for the 12 signs. And now it's time to look at things from the viewpoint of the I Ching. So I asked the question, what is Wednesday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 57, which is the gentle. Now, this hexagram is very much about air. So in the I Ching, we've got trigrams and we've got hexagrams. So we've got two trigrams. A trigram has 3 lines, and these trigrams. 2 trigrams represent air, a double trigram, the same trigram repeated. And so, it is very airy, and we get the idea of the wind sort of moving from place to place. It's quite inconstant in the sense that it keeps moving from one place to another. It can't be held in one place. And one idea about the gentle that the I Ching talks about is looking for the source of the matter. For example, we might be looking for something that is wrong, or if you want to be dramatic about it, the source of evil. Is there evil? Is evil abroad? Is it everywhere? And so we get the idea of looking everywhere. We're looking everywhere for something that is fundamentally bad, that is corrupting everything. And in the end, we have the possibility of actually finding it. But the key thing is we have to sort of keep moving. Perhaps we keep moving in quite a random way. We don't fully know where we're going. Perhaps even we don't even care where we're going. It's just constant action, constant thinking. And it's kind of interesting that we got this hexagram, the gentle, at a time when we have got Mercury opposition Jupiter. I mean, I know that Mercury is in Capricorn and Jupiter's in Cancer, so it's kind of not in air signs, but there is a feeling here of movement, always moving. We can't stop in one place, and we're kind of looking for something, but we're not quite sure where we're going. Now, the bottom line does move. And because the bottom line moves, there is a danger here that this, at the beginning of a process, that we are thinking too much and we're worrying too much as well. And perhaps what we need is a set of orders. That set of orders might come from another person. It might come from ourselves. And if one uses a military analogy, one should perhaps be like the common foot soldier. It's not up to you to decide the big strategy. You're kind of told what to do, and you are decisive, And it's important not to procrastinate. One good way not to procrastinate is just to be told what to do. You've got to do it. You have to follow orders. But I think it would be ideal if we were following our own orders. This is a situation that cannot go on forever. We can't spend forever thinking, although I think we might, at least today, as far as today is concerned, because of that Mercury opposition Jupiter. And so we try as far as possible to be decisive, but not in a way that is garnering a huge amount of attention. We're just being very clear about what actually needs to be done. And because we've got the bottom line moving, it means we move to a second hexagram, and the hexagram we move to is hexagram number 9, which is the taming power of the small. And it's kind of more of the same. It's saying we've got to an extent, limit ourselves. Because, going back to the astrology, Mercury opposition Jupiter, we could be thinking forever and getting nowhere. And the taming power of the small, there's a danger. What we just focus on really small, insignificant things and miss the big picture. So taming power of the small, we need to have some control over ourselves. We're not going to achieve a huge amount today, but it's perhaps enough to be thinking about some small goal. We're going to be decisive. We're going to achieve that small goal, and once we've done that, maybe we can look at the situation again, and maybe we can be more expansive and more optimistic, and also sort of more ambitious. And now it's time to think about that opposition between Mercury and Jupiter. So let's look at the chart. So here's a chart for the precise moment that Mercury is opposition Jupiter. So here it is. I make it that it happens at sort of 8:17 a.m. today, Wednesday, January the 14th. And you can see that Mercury is at 1934 Capricorn. Jupiter is at 1934 Cancer. So what is this aspect, fundamentally about? Mercury and Jupiter are very different planets. Mercury, you could argue, is sort of lower level. Mercury likes to deal with the facts, small things. I'm saying this as a Gemini. I've got my Mercury in Gemini. I might give the impression sometimes with astrology of being into sort of these big concepts, but honestly, I can get completely focused on the most tiny details, tiny factual details. So, don't be fooled by first impressions. But, Mercury can get obsessed with small things. And, that might be gossip, just random facts, memorizing all the capital cities of the world, or maybe the state capitals. Just that can be a Gemini thing. And of course, Virgo has a connection with Mercury as well. So Mercury can be just be looking at things perhaps on a superficial level. And then Jupiter is different. Jupiter is the visionary. Jupiter's looking at things on a broader level. And Jupiter is a moral planet. And I think this is something that is often forgotten. Jupiter is the king of the gods in Roman mythology, or Zeus in Greek mythology. And Jupiter, has the overview. And Jupiter indeed has a sense of right and wrong. I know that one often associates Saturn with judges, but one can also associate Jupiter with judges, laying down the law. And certainly Jupiter and Sagittarius can be associated with the law courts. And so there's a very different perspective here. Jupiter is about the broader picture, whereas Mercury is about something small. Perhaps Mercury on its own just doesn't have the vision that Jupiter has. So this is perhaps why I said, Mercury argues and Jupiter moralizes. Mercury can argue all over the place. Mercury can be caught up with this fact and that fact, and maybe the actual moral quality of the argument doesn't matter to Mercury. It's like the Monty Python sketch, isn't it? Where you pay for an argument, and maybe, but Jupiter wants to go beyond the argument, and you can argue. As far as Jupiter is concerned, you can argue all you like, but you've got to think about the truth. I know it's unpopular to think about the truth at the moment, but we all have our subjective truths, don't we? So, so that is the distinction between the two. And so today we have Mercury opposition Jupiter. And so, what might that mean? I think that the aspect is potentially moral. I think that the aspect could be about a moral conflict. And are people just talking for the sake of it? But are they forgetting what is really important? And we also think about moral high ground. And as I've said, as a Gemini, I can't stand it when people take the moral high ground. I certainly remember as a child when I did something unpleasant. I was quite an unpleasant child, actually. But when a teacher took the moral high ground and sort of said, "This is terrible what you did, really awful," or some other person, it never worked. I just always responded, "No, I wasn't listening." I was kind of outraged that someone would take the moral high ground with me, and even as an adult, you may actually occasionally see it in the comments. Sometimes I say something about a controversial subject, and someone wants to take a moral high ground. I'm just not into really the moral high ground. But, I'm just talking about myself here. But that is the conflict, and perhaps the issues around moral high ground, and are perhaps going to be important. And this might be what this Mercury-Jupiter aspect is about. It can also just be about thinking. Mercury represents thought, and so if Mercury is opposition Jupiter, we might get the idea of indeed doing a lot of thinking, but it could be thinking that is perhaps going nowhere. That is a possibility, because Jupiter can simply be an exaggerator. It needn't just be a moral force. It can just be an exaggerator. It exaggerates what it touches. So with Mercury opposition Jupiter, Jupiter can cause us to do a lot of thinking. It can cause us to do a lot of talking. But how far is it going? Now, we shouldn't forget, though, that Jupiter is in Cancer and Mercury is in Capricorn. I know Jupiter's retrograde, but Jupiter in Cancer, it's quite a strong Jupiter, and I think it is quite a moral Jupiter. So issues of morality may come to the fore, over the course of the day. Now, I did look at this Mercury-Jupiter opposition from the perspective of the midpoint. So if you look at this Mercury-Jupiter opposition on the 90-degree dial, here it is. So my apologies if you haven't seen a 90-degree dial before. I'd love to spend time explaining it, but basically the 90-degree dial is just it's putting every planet in terms of its cardinalities. So you divide, you have the cardinal planets, you have the fixed planets, and you have the mutable planets, and you forget the sign. So we've got Mercury in Capricorn, so that's at 19 degrees, 20 degrees Capricorn. So the first third is the cardinal planets, then then fixed, then mutable. But hopefully I'll do a video explaining this at some stage, sooner rather than later. So there is the Mercury-Jupiter opposition. Now on the dial, Mercury and Jupiter, the opposition is shown as a conjunction, because both Mercury and Jupiter are cardinal. I mean, they're at 19 degrees 34 cardinal, so they're regarded as being in the same place. And they are opposition the moon. There's moon. So what does it mean by moon? That means that there is a semi-square sesquiquadrate between the moon. And so we have to think about what that means. I think that makes the Mercury-Jupiter opposition all the more important, because it is semi-square sesquiquadrate the moon when it actually happens. And the moon is a communication planet as well. So that really might say something about how people are communicating, and perhaps there is a desperate need to get a message across. And additionally, we have to think about midpoints. This might seem kind of a bit obscure, but if you look at the dial, there is Hades and Kronos. I use these hypothetical planets, and Hades is the planet of death and decay. Kronos is the planet of the law. It's a kind of rather like Saturn, and it's linked with, and it's on the other side of it there's the Sun-Mars conjunction we have. So that means that this Mercury-Jupiter opposition is aspecting the Mars-Kronos, the Mars-Hades, Sun-Kronos, Sun-Hades. So that may say something about the nature of what people are talking about, what people are moralizing about. And yet Sun-Hades, Mars-Hades, it's about unpleasantness. It's also about the unpleasantness of the government. I mean, Kronos is a planet connected with the government. Mars-Kronos, Sun-Kronos, linked with Hades. We are very much thinking about what governments are doing, and the unpleasantness of governments, even the evil of governments. And all governments have a capacity for evil. So, whatever country you're in, people are thinking about their government and what their government is doing. I'm not myself going to moralize here. I'm going to be Mercury rather than Jupiter. But you have to look at every situation in terms of your own views and your own opinions. What is your government doing? Is your government right, or is your government wrong? And I think this Mercury opposition Jupiter is really showing us what happens when power is misused. People are thinking about it. And by the way, I'm making no comment about Trump here or what's going on in the United States. I'm not giving an opinion here. Power is being misused in a lot of countries, whether it's Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Ukraine, wherever you are, you can see the abuses of power. And I think that this Mercury opposition Jupiter is really going to make us really think about it. And finally, I want to just look at some examples of Mercury-Jupiter opposition. We can talk about the Mercury-Jupiter opposition theoretically, but what actually happens when Mercury is opposition Jupiter? So a recent event, relatively recent, was the killing of Brian Thompson. So Brian Thompson was CEO of United Healthcare. And that's a horoscope of Brian Thompson. He was, if you're interested, he was a Cancerian, but his actual killing, I think it happened around 6:45 in the morning. So this is a chart for when he was shot in the street in New York. I mean, someone has been arrested for it and is going through the legal system. That, of course, is Luigi Mangione. We have no idea, whether or not he did it. Innocent till proven guilty, as far as I'm concerned. But indeed, not just as far as I'm concerned. He is innocent until proven guilty. But certainly, there's someone who the federal government believes did it. But in terms of understanding the shooting, it's just useful to know that Mercury is opposition Jupiter, and Mercury was, exactly opposition Jupiter, and that might tell us something about how Mercury and Mercury-Jupiter oppositions operate, and I think that there perhaps is a moral connection with this, and it could be a reckoning. Now, the reason I say this is because if you look at Brian Thompson's chart, now remember, he was CEO of United Healthcare. He was a very rich man. I mean, for someone who was an employee, I believe he had, I don't know, he had a fortune of tens of millions. He didn't even found United Healthcare. But, there were a lot of criticisms of United Healthcare about how it was treating customers and perhaps denying them insurance. But perhaps that was reflected in how he behaved as a CEO, as a health insurance company. And what I find interesting about Brian Thompson's horoscope is that Brian Thompson, I don't have a time of birth for Brian Thompson, but he had his North Node at 19 Sagittarius, and he had his Venus at 17 Gemini, and so he had his South Node at 19 Sagittarius, obviously by definition. So if you then go and compare if you then go and compare the two charts, you start to see something really interesting happening. So this means that the Mercury-Jupiter opposition, which took place when he was shot, was right on his nodal axis. And so how do we see the nodes? I mean, the nodes, if we look at it from a karmic perspective, we see the North Node is where you should be going to, his North Node in Sagittarius. He had the South Node in Gemini. So Jupiter, perhaps conjunct his South Node, was just bringing about the consequences of his actions. That's not a moral judgment here. I mean, there is no doubt, or there's little doubt, that, I won't say, I've had to be careful here. There is a possibility that the fact that he was CEO of United Healthcare led to his death, and that perhaps his actions as a successful CEO of United Healthcare, I assume he was successful by the amount of money he had, did have an impact. So the Mercury-Jupiter opposition impacted him, but maybe it had an impact on whoever killed him. And so Mercury-Jupiter opposition can be, this is it. And there is a moral side to it, and there's a thinking side to it. Someone is thinking, someone is believing they're behaving in a moral way, perhaps. We don't know. So that is a way in which the Mercury-Jupiter can happen, can come about. Now, Mercury-Jupiter can also be about news. Just news. And the news might be important if you live in a particular country. So the death of Queen Elizabeth II. So here's the death of the Queen in 2022, and there's Mercury at 8 degrees Libra, Jupiter at 6 degrees Aries, and I don't think it was the Mercury-Jupiter opposition that led to her death. I mean, I don't think. I'm not really looking at her chart here, but it's more Mercury-Jupiter opposition is about news. I mean, that's what it is. People responding to the news. And so it just could be as simple as that. Now, when you have got a Mercury-Jupiter opposition, your cognition may not be perfect. You may reach the wrong conclusion. You might be trigger happy. And in terms of the Vietnam War, the My Lai massacre, when American troops went into a Vietnamese village and they massacred a huge amount of, I don't know what the figures were. Dozens of villagers were killed by American troops, and this happened at the same time as a Mercury-Jupiter opposition. Mercury was at 28 degrees Aquarius, Jupiter was at 27 Leo, and so you get that idea. You think about what these American troops were thinking, the conclusions they were reaching, and Jupiter can be about exaggeration. You look at the way the villagers are responding to you, you look at their body language, and you're already nervous, and that can kind of flip you over. Now, interestingly, it was pretty close to the My Lai massacre. So the My Lai massacre was on March the 16th, 1968, was the Phong Nai massacre. So that was on March the 12th, 1968. So the Phong Nai massacre was a pretty similar thing. But this time it wasn't American troops, it was South Korean troops went into a village in South Vietnam. It's often forgotten that the South Koreans were involved in South Vietnam. And yeah, similar situation. I think maybe one of a South Korean soldier was maybe shot, I think, and they responded, and again there was a massacre. I think they responded to the massacre. They tried to compensate for it by leaving some bags of rice next to the village in the village to compensate for that. Not really adequate compensation, I don't think. But again, you have Mercury opposition Jupiter, so you can see how this might work. Now, Mercury-Jupiter opposition can be about exaggeration, and it can be about an exaggerated response. And so the Rainbow Warrior, because it happened quite a long time ago, 1985. This was an act of terrorism committed by the French government. The Rainbow Warrior was a ship operated by Greenpeace, and it was in Auckland Harbour in New Zealand. And Greenpeace were using this ship to go close to an area where the French were conducting a nuclear test. And so Greenpeace were trying their best to disrupt the test by going into the exclusion zone, and the French didn't appreciate it, and so they sent some agents to New Zealand, and they blew the boat up. And in the process, I think a photographer was on board, and the photographer was killed. So this happened when there was a Mercury-Jupiter opposition. So there was where's Mercury gone? Mercury was at 14 Leo, Jupiter was at 15 Aquarius. So this is how Mercury-Jupiter might work. It might just exaggerate, and you think about Jupiter as being about morality, but whose morality? There are issues of morality here. So from a French perspective, you'd say, well, the higher moral state reason was, well, we need to have these nuclear tests, and so maybe the end justifies the means. And this Mercury-Jupiter opposition, was quite close to the 45-degree aspect to the solstice point, so that would give it extra power. So when you think about the killing of Brian Thompson and the My Lai and the Phong Nai massacre and the Rainbow Warrior, you don't think that the Mercury-Jupiter opposition is just going to operate at the level of ideas. It can be about a single action, or perhaps a single disaster. And there are a couple of disasters that took place when Mercury-Jupiter was Mercury and Jupiter were opposition. For example, the death of Ayrton Senna. I'm not going to look at that. I've looked at that chart quite recently. So during the San Marino Grand Prix, you had two drivers who died, Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger. And so the San Marino Grand Prix in 1994 took place at the time of the Mercury-Jupiter opposition. There were a load of other bad things going on at the time of the San Marino Grand Prix, but you can see Mercury opposition Jupiter might say something about the cognitions of the racing drivers. If you're driving around a circuit at hundreds of miles an hour, your brain, you've got to use your brain, and you've got to act very quickly. And Mercury opposition Jupiter may be about an overreaction. I don't know about the details. Maybe it was the overreaction of another driver or something. I have no idea. But that can certainly be how it works. Or Mercury-Jupiter can be into fantastic effects, wanting to create something dramatic. Mercury, I have this idea, I'm going to do something really spectacular. And with the fire in Switzerland at the Constellation nightclub or bar in Switzerland, where all those people were killed, people talked a lot about the station fire. And so here is which took place in where did it take place? I should know. Rhode Island, sorry. This is a chart of the Rhode Island fire, and at this time of the station fire, Mercury was exactly conjunct Neptune, opposition Jupiter in Leo. So Mercury conjunct Neptune in Aquarius. There's the big idea, a wonderful idea. Mercury conjunct Neptune, perhaps a rather distorted idea, but an idea nonetheless, and it's opposition Jupiter in Leo. And so that happened at the time of this fire, which killed a great many people. And finally, just a couple of people who got Mercury opposition Jupiter. I mean, some of these charts, all of these charts I've looked at before. I mean, Barack Obama has Mercury opposition Jupiter. I don't know whether this aspect will have an impact on him, but he's got Mercury at 0 degrees Leo, Jupiter at 0 degrees Aquarius. I mean, this might, whatever you think about Obama, may say something about the fortunate aspect of having it. You can speak. I mean, in the Kamala Harris's campaign, his interventions didn't really go down very well, but when he was on peak form in 2008, he was certainly an effective orator. Okay, you could say that Mercury is conjunct true Black Moon Lilith, opposition Jupiter. So maybe this is saying something about Barack Obama we don't fully know about. And another person who has Mercury opposition Jupiter, who has a very high opinion of himself, is Emmanuel Macron, the French president. I haven't got his chart. Oh yeah, I have got his chart. Here it is. So Emmanuel Macron has a dissociate opposition. He's got Jupiter at 1 degree Cancer, Mercury at 29 degrees. Mercury at what? 20. What was Mercury? Mercury at 29 degrees Sagittarius. So Mercury opposition Jupiter. In Emmanuel Macron's case, he's always saying something. Always saying something. He's got a lot to say. And in the process, he can get himself into, well, he's got his country into trouble. He always has to intervene. His mind is always thinking. I mean, clearly, Emmanuel Macron is a very clever guy. I think Emmanuel Macron is just an example of completely wasted intelligence. I think he probably could have done a lot of good if he'd perhaps been not quite so sort of egocentric, and that Mercury opposition Jupiter in Macron's case just could be, about arrogance. And finally, two people who I think there are moral issues with both of them, and one of them is someone you might not have heard of. Well, you've probably heard about his story. Is Maxim Kuzminov. So Maxim Kuzminov was a Russian helicopter pilot, and he defected to the Ukrainians with his helicopter. So you could say, well, that was a great coup for the Ukrainians. Thing is that he defected with, I believe, 2 other Russian soldiers or airmen on board. And as a result of his defection, both of them were killed. We don't quite know how they were killed, whether they were just executed or what happened to them. And Maxim Kuzminov, he was, of course, given his reward, and he went to Spain, and he was, I think he was shot to death and run over in a parking lot, car park somewhere in Spain. And he had Mercury opposition Jupiter, Mercury in Gemini opposition Jupiter in Sagittarius. And his explanation of it was, while he was in the armed services, he in the Air Force, or whatever he was in, he read a lot, and he read a lot about the Ukraine war, and he decided that that Russia was being unreasonable, and he changed his mind. And that might be Mercury in Gemini. Mercury in Gemini can be tricky. Mercury in Gemini can change. And of course, Jupiter in Sagittarius, it's a strong Jupiter in Sagittarius. There might have been a moral element to it, but somehow in that Mercury-Jupiter opposition, somehow the morality got lost because of his actions. 2 of his crewmen were executed or killed by the Ukrainians. So I don't think it might have a veneer of morality, but there was something fundamentally immoral about it. So we can see the sort of interplay perhaps there with Mercury and Jupiter. And finally, I think this gives an idea perhaps of Mercury-Jupiter at its worst is Roland Freisler. Roland Freisler, he was a German judge who was in charge of the People's Court. So, for example, after the 1944 plot against Hitler, it was him who had his People's Court, who was screaming at the accused of people in the dock, sentencing them to death. He was also conducting a trial of Sophie Scholl and the Scholl siblings a bit earlier, and so he got his inspiration by he was quite familiar with the Soviet Union. I think he'd been captured during the First World War and spent time in a Russian prisoner of war camp, and he'd been watching Stalin's purges, and he'd been watching the show trials in Moscow, and he kind of seemed to sort of imitate it a bit at all. So, but the Mercury opposition Jupiter, so he has Mercury at 29. He had Mercury at 29 Scorpio. Opposition Jupiter and Taurus, clearly haranguing, and of course false morality. Saying, "Oh, this is terrible. You are, in his own way, trying to seize the moral high ground, saying, you have betrayed the regime. You tried to kill Hitler. You've whatever. So this is what you deserve." So that's perhaps Mercury Jupiter, at its absolute worst, and he was. In the end, killed by an American bomb. So anyway, those are a few thoughts on the Mercury-Jupiter opposition. I think it is quite an important aspect. So thank you very much for watching this video. If you did enjoy this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.